Alright, so like I mentioned in the previous video, I was actually part of a Toastmasters club for about 3 to 4 years, 4 years. And I was really gung-ho about it, but people thought like I was in love with the organization, but it was just like what I'd been missing for since the 90s started, which was like a sense of community and a sense of belonging to a certain place where there was not just my immediate family of my two parents and my sister who dished us, but like a community of people. Unfortunately, it was a very revolving door kind of group, so there were always new people coming in. And as the people got crazier and crazier with the Trump presidency, I just started catching a lot of passive aggressive hate from those people, and I just had to go. But I felt like now that I read this book, I can see how belonging to the group kind of affected me with the propaganda that is ubiquitous in our society. So let's get to the next section, which is continuity and duration of propaganda. So propaganda must be continuous and lasting. Continuous in that it must not leave any gaps, but must fill the citizen's whole day and all of his days. All his days. Lasting in that it must function over a very long period of time. So this is talking about the media and all those other ways of propaganda. These are their aims, to be continuous and lasting. Now I've heard of like ex-girlfriends and even ex-boyfriends coming back into their lives after many years when they previously dissed the partner. And then it's like, I think that has to do with the continuity of propaganda, because the longer you're staying around somebody, the more effect they have on you, you know? So, continuity and duration of propaganda. Propaganda tends to make the individual live in a separate world. He must not have outside points of reference. He must not be allowed a moment of meditation or reflection in which to see himself with the propagandist, as happens when the propaganda is not continuous. So this is why, and females are especially good at this, they don't like people who are too eccentric and too outside the box, you know? And that becomes a threat because they have husbands around and they don't want the husbands to catch those ideas. So it's like they have to make their husbands live in a separate world and not have outside points of reference. Just an example. So there must not be allowed a moment of meditation or reflection. That's why when the husband comes back home, the wife starts nagging immediately because her propaganda instincts come up, you know? So it must be continuous, and at that moment the individual emerges from the grip of propaganda when it's not continuous. That's why MGTOW is a antidote, if executed right, to the pervasive propaganda in our society. So instead, successful propaganda will occupy every moment of the individual's life, through posters and loudspeakers when he's out walking, through radio and newspapers at home, through meetings and movies in the evening. So that reminds me of 1984 and Big Brother, how Big Brother is always watching you, and everywhere you go you see his eyes following you. That's pretty much referring to propaganda. And it also reminds me of the Lord of the Rings and the eye. The all-pervasive eye on top of the dollar bill too. So the individual must not be allowed to recover, to collect himself, to remain untouched by propaganda during any relatively long period. For propaganda is not the touch of the magic wand. It is based on slow, constant impregnation. So here they talk about the Repetition. The famous principle of repetition, which is not in itself significant, plays a part only in this situation. He's talking about the continuous and lasting propaganda. Hitler was undoubtedly right when he said that the masses take a long time to understand and remember. Thus it is necessary to repeat. But the emphasis must be placed on a long time. The public must be conditioned to accept the claims that are made. In any case, repetition must be discontinued when the public has been conditioned, for at that point repetition will begin to irritate and provoke fresh doubts with respect to former certainties. Oh wow. I remember at the club many key people were dissing me about my assumptions and making assumptions. And I think I was starting to doubt some of their conditionings. So it creates convictions. All right. So the slow, constant impregnation of the long period of propaganda creates convictions and compliance through imperceptible influences that are effective only by continuous repetition. It must create a complete environment for the individual, one from which he never emerges. And to prevent him from finding external points of reference, that's why girls get mad when you even so much look at another ass. But they don't want to have outside points of reference. So to prevent him from finding external points of reference, it protects him by censoring everything that might come in from the outside. Censors. Cancel culture. The tyrannical feminization and childish feminization of society. And to prevent him from, the slow building up of reflexes and myths, of psychological environment and prejudices, requires propaganda of very long duration. So that reminds me of how in the 50s and before, American women knew their power and they would joke about how the men thought that they were useless in terms of affecting society, but they would laugh about how they were in control of the kids and their minds, and therefore they were creating the future through brainwashing the kids, basically, which is what we see today. And so the slow building up of reflexes and myths, that is of a long duration. Psychological environment and prejudices too. We'll be right back. So propaganda is not a stimulus that disappears quickly. It consists of successive impulses and shocks aimed at various feelings or thoughts by means of the many instruments previously mentioned. A relay system is thus established. Propaganda is a continuous action without failure or interruption. As soon as the effect of one impulse is weakened, it is renewed by another. At no point does it fail to subject its recipient to its influence. As soon as one effect wears off, it is followed by a new shock. So it's very continuous, it's long lasting. Right now they're talking about the continuous aspect of it. Continuous propaganda exceeds the individual's capacities for attention or adaptation. So it exceeds the individual's. That's what I felt about that group. There were so many people there, and it was just so happening, I guess. There was just so much going on that it's easy, at least for somebody like me who's not used to that environment, to be overwhelmed by it. And that's part of the propaganda force that it exerts, because there's a lot of repetition involved, and all the knowledge is basically not really from the grassroots. It's all top down. So anyway, the continuous propaganda exceeds the individual capacities for attention or adaptation, and thus its capabilities of resistance. That's what I complain about the news too, and how, especially if you see Indian news, my God, they got like 5-6 people talking at the same time, with quotes under their pictures and all kinds of stuff going on in the images. So it just overwhelms your capacity for reason. This trait of continuity explains why propaganda can indulge in sudden twists and turns. So twists and turns are part of propaganda. And speaking of girls, I talk about mixed signals. I think I do that too, though. Because I just don't give a fuck, I guess. The propagandist does not necessarily have to worry about coherence and unity in his claims. Claims can be varied and even contradictory, depending on the setting. So that reminds me of 1984, how one day they're saying one thing and the other day they're saying the opposite. So coherence and unity doesn't have to be necessary for propaganda. They can be varied and even contradictory depending on the setting and the occasion. And he gives some examples there. So alright, sudden twists and turns, right? It is always surprising that the content of propaganda can be so inconsistent that it can approve today what it condemned yesterday. So, yeah. Now they're saying now they're saying the opposite in the coronavirus CPR procedures of what they used to say. And that's funny, because CPR should be the same forever. So it is inconsistent, and Antonio Mioto considers this changeability of propaganda an indication of its nature. Actually, it is only an indication of the grip it exerts, of the reality of its effects. We must not think that a man ceases to follow the line when there is a sharp turn. He continues to follow it because he is caught up in the system. Of course, he notices the change that has taken place, and he is surprised. He may even be tempted to resist, as the communists were at the time of the German-Soviet Pact. So I was just thinking about how Alan Watt talks about when he sees the foxes in his area, and when there's like a change in the environment, like a tree has fallen or someone is constructing something new, they stop dead in their tracks and they don't move, and they start analyzing what's going on around them to get the new picture of their environment. But because today we have this continuous and long-lasting propaganda, the continuity of it, the overwhelming nature of it, makes us not able to freeze and analyze it, because it freezes us in fear and not in awareness, which is by design. So he may be tempted to resist, as the communists were at the time of the German-Soviet Pact, but will he then engage in a sustained effort to resist propaganda? Will he disavow his past actions? Will he break with the environment in which his propaganda is active? Will he stop reading a particular newspaper? Such breaks are too painful. Faced with them, the individual, feeling that the change in line is not an attack on his real self, prefers to retain his habits. That's why more men than women tend to be red pill, because these breaks are very painful. And some people would rather not perceive it as an attack on their real self because they're in the fake self, so they retain their old habits and stay stuck in the propaganda, I guess. So immediately thereafter, he will hear the new truth reassessed 100 times. He will find it explained and proved, and he does not have the strength to fight against it each day on the basis of yesterday's truth. He does not even become fully involved in this battle. Propaganda continues its assault without an instant's respite. His resistance is fragmentary and sporadic. He is caught up in professional tasks and personal preoccupations, and each time he emerges from them, he hears and sees the new truth proclaimed. The steadiness of the propaganda prevails over his sporadic attention and makes him follow all the turns from the time he has begun to eat of his bread, of this bread. That's interesting, because even if you detach from propaganda in the society, when you come back, it's just changed so much and it's so much more powerful that it's hard to maintain. Because I mean, we can only stay awake 16 hours in the day, right? And then we need to sleep too. And while we're awake, we can't just work the whole time. We have to rest too. So it just the continuity of the modern propaganda is so intense that nobody can really escape from it completely. That's what he's trying to say. This is why one cannot really speak of propaganda in connection with an election campaign that lasts only 2 weeks. At such a time, some intellectual always will show that election propaganda is ineffectual, that its gross methods, its inscriptions on walls can convince nobody, that opposing arguments neutralize each other. And it is true that the population is often indifferent to election propaganda, but it is not surprising that such propaganda has little effect. None of the great techniques of propaganda can be effective in 2 weeks. So he's just saying propaganda has to be long-lasting. I guess that's why girls have 2 methods of preying on guys now. They have their instant fix, Tinder, and all those groups of guys. And then they have the ones they think they can leech off for longer time. So for them, they use the more continuous propaganda. I don't know. And that's just an idea. So having no more relation to real propaganda are the experiments often undertaken to discover whether some propaganda method is effective on a group of individuals being used as guinea pigs. So now he's talking about experiments, which are ruined by the fact that they are of short duration, and the individual can clearly discern any propaganda when it suddenly appears in a social environment normally not subject to this type of influence. So if you want to expose propaganda, I guess you gotta come to a new social environment and bring something new, and that will help individuals discern it. I think that's what Donna did in our club. She was just so outlandish as a feminazi, kind of dominant, strong woman that, and she was stronger than the average woman who thinks she's strong. So she was a good teacher, I think. Anyway, if one isolated item of propaganda, so yeah. Moreover, the individual can clearly discern any propaganda when it suddenly appears in a social environment normally not subject to this type of influence. That's what I think the PUA guys used to say, like how the old bull said to the young bull, or the young bull said to the old bull, let's go down and run and rape all those cows. And the old bull said, no, let's just walk down and then we can have all those cows and we don't have to chase them. Something like that. So the old bull knew about propaganda because he didn't want them to discern the propaganda, right? That's the idea, I guess. So individual discerns it when it suddenly appears, and if one isolated item of propaganda or one campaign appears without a massive effort, The contrast is so strong that the individual can recognize it clearly as propaganda and begin to be wary. So also if it's too isolated and doesn't have a lot of effort, it creates a strong contrast that can help you recognize it as propaganda. But the best propaganda is the ones you can't notice, obviously. That's one thing people don't realize. So that is precisely what happens in an election campaign. The individual can defend himself when left to himself in his everyday situation. That is why it is fatal to the effectiveness of propaganda to proceed in spurts, with big noisy campaigns separated by long gaps. In such circumstances, the individual will always find his bearings again. He will know how to distinguish propaganda from the rest of what the press carries in normal times. Moreover, the more intense the propaganda campaign, the more alert he will become, comparing the sudden intensity with the great calm that reigned before. So I hope I'm not making new propagandists right now. I'm hoping that I help make you resistant. Join the resistance, like Alex Jones says. What is needed then is continuous agitation produced artificially, even when nothing in the events of the day justifies or arouses excitement. So the most smooth operators, I guess, are the ones who can maintain that continuous agitation produced artificially, even when nothing justifies or arouses excitement. So therefore, continuing propaganda must slowly create a climate first, and then prevent the individual from noticing a particular propaganda operation in contrast to ordinary daily events. So that's about it for that section. Next section is about the organization of propaganda, and that's a longer section. Anyway, until next time, Propaganda by Jackus.